Hello, everyone. I'm Carl Whitaker, Director of Research and Analysis here at RealPage, and one of the rotating hosts of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. Today's guest was a really lively discussion. We were joined by Jesse McConnico. Jesse is the research manager for John Burns Real Estate, or JBREC Multifamily arm of research. She's a really great voice in the industry, especially within the multifamily research space. And we got her thoughts on her background in the space, and equally exciting, what trends she's watching for the industry over the coming year. Let's go ahead and take it away. We hope you enjoy the next half an hour or so of the discussion. Thank you for joining, Jesse. Really grateful that you took some time to chat with us. And I think this will be a good conversation. We're going to target about 40 minutes overall. This is just part of the broader RealPage podcast, RealPage branded podcast, I should say. And just a little bit of background for one of the reasons why we brought you on. As one of the hosts, I've been asked to bring in kind of a market researchy skewed element and talk to folks such as yourself that work day to day in market research, what you're seeing in the space, even how you got into the space, what the value of the market research role is. So having said all that, this is your time. I want to make sure that you get a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and who you work for.
Yeah, my name is Jesse McConnico. I work for John Burns Research and Consulting. We just rebranded, but now we go by JBREC officially. I am a research manager there, but I kind of focus more on the rental side. So I am our internal expert on apartments and build to rent. So kind of a newer sector still that we're exploring, but BTR, as we call it, is kind of like my bread and butter along with apartments.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because we will get into a little bit of that BTR space. And that was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you into the fold here, because you're the first guest that we've had that really focuses in that subsector. But there's been a lot of questions about that subsector. So I think you can add some good insight. Really quick too, just for clarity, I've heard it called SFR, I've heard it called BTR, I've heard it called single family rentals. Do you have a preferred moniker for it?
Mm-hmm. We call it BTR, and that comes from a lot of research on Google searches, kind of like insight there, asking our clients, kind of surveying the market. We're really big into surveys at JBREC. So we landed on BTR versus BFR. So we say build to rent, and then the SFR that you're referring to is more like the scattered site single family rental. So the way we differentiate the two is SFR is scattered site, so individual lots, whereas BTR is like a designated contiguous community of rental homes.
Got it. And thank you for clarifying that, just because I know that's sometimes a question. And we tend to think the same way. You know, SFR isn't necessarily interchangeable with BTR. SFR, scattered site, probably a better way to put it. But I just wanted to clear that up as we get into the discussion, because I know sometimes our audience is like, hey, you know, how do you define BTR versus SFR versus a whole litany of other things?
Yeah, for sure.
So I promised you we would start with this question. We probably don't even really need an icebreaker, because we've already been talking for a few minutes before we started recording. But this is just a fun icebreaker I've been asking some folks who have joined thus far. Your last 3 artists played in your Spotify, Apple Music, whatever your music service is. What are those last 3 artists, and how do you feel about those artists?
Yeah, Carl, you warned me that you were going to ask me this question. And I told you that by the time we actually recorded this podcast, I was going to listen to some better artists that I was more proud to tell you about. But I must confess that I still listen to Justin Bieber and Taylor Swift pretty regularly. I even bought tickets to a Taylor Swift concert last week. No, but actually, let's see. Let me pull up my Spotify. I definitely listen to the Biebs and T Swift, but okay. Also, the 1975 actually is probably my most listened to. I actually went to their concert earlier this year. I think it was earlier this year. And it was the best concert I've ever been to. Like, they put on a whole show. It's so good. And then I also on here is Moon Taxi and The Parcels. So a little bit a little bit better than Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber.
Well, I like the candidacy, and I like just kind of the, hey, this is what I listen to. There's nothing inherently good or bad with that, and I like that you're just, you're honest about what you're listening to, and I'll just say that I also like the indie acts that you mentioned there, kind of that indie rock, Moon Taxi and Parcels, and I'll give that a thumbs up for sure.
Thank you.
So going back to, and I'm also glad you mentioned this earlier with John Burns Real Estate, now rebranded as JBREC, because that was going to be one of my questions as to what the rebranding looked like. But y'all put out some really, really great research on both multi and single family. For any folks in our audience that haven't come across JBREC, then highly recommend checking them out. I mean, even we, both internally and externally, will include some JBREC commentary in our slide decks. And you've probably seen this on some of our webcasts where we call out some information. So y'all do a wonderful job. But can you just tell me and our listeners a little bit about the company and the type of services that your team offers in particular?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, JBREC is a really amazing company. Some of the best minds in the industry, I would say. So I'm really proud to work here. We are known for our research and then consulting side. So on the research side, we look at single family, especially like home builders. And then we cover a wide variety from single family homes to single family rentals, to rental communities. As I mentioned before, those are our apartments in BTR. We also cover building products and even design trends through our New Home Trends Institute. And then part two of that is our consulting arm. So those are our boots on the ground experts that can get into the details and the weeds of different projects and help our clients make strategic decisions, whether that be where to build, what to charge, all kinds of decisions there.
Yeah, and the New Home Institute trend, or the New Home Trends Institute, that's a really interesting area because I'm currently in the process of remodeling a house that was built in the 90s, and it's funny because the things in the house, wood panel wainscoting, wallpaper, dark green carpet, those things
nice.
are those. Yeah, exactly. You see it now and you're like, oh wow, that's really dated. But at the time, that was the trend. So it's really cool to be able to keep up with some of those even more qualitative components of the space. You and I live a lot in the numbers, but there's clearly this big qualitative component that I think is important to market research too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I love that you have green carpet.
Well, that makes one of us that enjoys it. No. We are not going to keep that. So,
well, let us know if you need any design insight and what's trendy. We can help you out there.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that. And actually, you touch on something there that I'm kind of going off script here on our discussion that we had earlier, but you mentioned earlier that John Burns Real Estate uses a lot of surveys as well, or really enjoys survey methodology. Of course, there's the quantitative component where you get into the numbers. How do y'all blend that qualitative versus quantitative together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's kind of like the value of having both a research and consulting side. So I mentioned earlier that our consulting is like the boots on the ground. So whereas I live in the data of my market every day, we actually have people who are like going out and surveying communities and different properties and can give us that color. So we do have surveys. We survey home builders, we survey about land. We just launched an apartment developer and investor survey. So we've got all kinds of color on the survey side. But then our consultants can come in too and say, hey, we also did this and we talked to all of these people. So in our analysis, when we're doing our reports, we show a graph, but we also try and give you like the real color of what we're seeing in the data, but also what our consultants on the ground are seeing too.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that's something that research benefits a lot from both components. And it's fair if you're sometimes skewed 80% quantitatively, 20% qualitatively, or vice versa. But I don't think you can be totally agnostic of the other side of the equation. I think you have to have a blend of both quantitative and qualitative. Sometimes that can be difficult because if you're talking to some real quants, then they're going to want to see, the data, how the methodology matches it. They want the number, and again, you said this is your role, so you can understand that. But I think the blend of it is really important. I think sometimes that's overlooked in our space.
I think so too. And I think one of the benefits of it is they're kind of seeing and calling out the trends before we see them in the data. So a lot of times, like I'll hear something from, I have like a regular check-in with one of our managing principals, and she's very much in like the rental side. And so sometimes she'll call out trends that I won't see in the data, but then a few months later, I'm like, oh my God, totally right. Like now we're seeing it in the data and I can back you with numbers now. So it's really interesting to kind of see that balance.
Yeah, they blend together really well.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that too, because that's interesting to note that some of that boots on the ground understanding can replace the numbers to a degree, and then the numbers can oftentimes provide the support for it. So,
Yeah, we have a really cool question in our home builder survey, and it kind of like it's a sentiment question, like just asking the home builders, okay, how are things trending? And a lot of times, like it'll call out trends before we see it in the data in that survey, just because it's sentiment based. And they're like, well, I feel that it's not going well. And after we see that a couple times, like then we'll start to see it in the numbers. And we're like, yep, they called it like a few months ahead of time too. So super cool.
sentiment ones are really fascinating, and I totally agree. I'll share something that we've been doing here at RealPage is that over the past couple quarters, we've been really keyed in on consumer sentiment because you look at things like job growth, wage growth, they're actually pretty strong right now, but apartment absorption wasn't strong at the same time. So it was kind of like, hey, what gives? Our best guess is that consumer sentiment fell. And, just as you say, if people don't feel good about the economy, if they don't feel good about what's happening out in the world, then they tend to change their behavior. So I could totally see where builders would do the same, but at the same time, it can be kind of hard to truly quantify that. So you do have to have that discussion, survey, and really absorb their information through that means.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did you end up in your current role at John Burns? How did you get into the more quantitative side of the space?
Yeah, sure. I actually, out of college, I started at CoStar Group, where that's when I started my career as an analyst and got into like the quant and the data in different markets. But I actually knew a few people who worked here. And then I got in touch with John, and he and I had some great conversations that made me kind of decide that I wanted to switch up my career a bit. And then they kind of just like created a position for me here as a senior analyst. So at first I worked like on the single family side as well as apartments, but then I was given the opportunity to create a team focused solely on apartments and BTR. And then we just put out our new rental communities analysis and forecast product, which covers both of those sectors and kind of how they intertwine with single family. So that is a lot of digging into data, a lot of new data, especially on the BTR side, a lot of RealPage data, and a lot of different sources, and trying to pull those together. So building a whole new product really requires you to really get deep into the data.
Yeah, and that's a lot of work. Building any new product like that's a lot of work, but the payoff is always worth it. And just the experience and value that you gain from that is really hard to replace.
Yes. Yeah, it was a long time coming. I think that project has been in the works for about a year and a half or so, and we got it out in June, and really proud of it. It's definitely a big lift, but it turned out really great.
Yeah, congratulations. We're recording
Thanks.
this in mid-August, so June isn't that far ago in the grand scheme of things. So, yeah, curious to see how that continues to unfold over the next couple months, the next couple years.
Yeah, thanks. Me too. Definitely still working on it, adding a lot of things to it. Like I said, we just launched our apartment developer and investor survey too. So part of that will be going into it. So a lot of moving pieces too, a lot more to come. So it's been exciting.
So I guess my next question, and I asked this somewhat for our audience and somewhat selfishly, and what I mean by that is, market research is kind of a niche within the industry. And, when people hear market research, they typically think about the person at the mall that's flagging down some of the walkers or, some of the shoppers and says, hey, what was your experience like? And, that is market research in all fairness. It's just a different kind of market research. So my question to you is, how do you, when talking to others, approach what is market research? And then on top of that, what do you think the value that market research brings to maybe some folks that aren't as up to speed on this side of the industry?
Yeah, I actually think like my answer is kind of the same for both of them, or it should be the same. My definition of market research is like telling the story of something and going through the data and picking out the points that link together and really trying to tell the story. And that's the value in it, is that story, the why behind everything. And that's really like what you want to glean from whatever you're looking at. So if you're looking at a good piece of research, it should be telling you some kind of story. So I think it's just a really quick way to learn what's going on in a market. At the end of the day, you could probably do what you do anywhere. But if you want to do it well, you need to know what is the market story, what's happening, what's coming, what drives the market, who's there, and then tailor your product or service to that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the same approach that, and I actually really like the way you phrase that, that the skills of market research, truthfully, are probably applicable to lots of different industries. You really are just taking a kind of a mess of data and getting down through it and saying, okay, if I have 2 minutes to grab somebody's attention, what do they need to know? They don't need to know how everything was made. I've always loved the saying, some people don't need to know what time, some people need to know what time it is, not how the watch was made. And I think oftentimes just being more quantitative driven, we can be prone to saying how the watch was made and where the watch came from, where all that data is coming from. But oftentimes it really just comes down to, hey, how do you tell this very succinct story? And then if needed, you can get into the more nuanced information as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think it's always good to kind of like take a step back and look at the broader trends and just make sure that you're not missing anything. Because sometimes you can get like so into the weeds of some numbers or trends or data, but you're not looking at the big picture. And I think that's really kind of like the big takeaway at the end of the day, as you said. It's funny, I used to give presentations in markets all the time at my previous employer. And usually the clients would come in thinking that, they knew everything. They didn't need to listen because they were in the market every day. But you can really, you can always learn something. Literally, I had someone to my face tell me that they weren't going to learn anything from my presentation before I gave it. And then on their way out, they stopped me and they said, actually, I learned a lot. And the data you presented offered really great new perspective on what was happening in their own market. So I feel like you can always learn something from that bigger picture, those broader trends.
Yeah, I like that. And it's funny. It's kind of like that thing where I don't know if you happen to live next to any big landmarks or any big, tourist attraction, for example. But a lot of times when you live so close to something like that, the real value of it tends to get watered down. And the reason I say that is I tend to agree that I think sometimes whenever you're talking to someone who's actually in that market, they know some intimate level details of that market far better than you and I can ever pretend to know, and we're certainly not trying to replace that person's understanding, but I think you can complement their understanding with that outside perspective. And I really like that anecdote that you offered there, because it was, just that perfect idea of, hey, here's how I'm seeing the data from the outside. And somebody says, oh, wow, I actually didn't think about that.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, that was something that I learned right out of college because I was young and I was new to the space, but I was giving presentations to sometimes C-suite people. My manager was like, you are in the data every day. You know what's going on. You're looking at the trends. These people are not. So like build up your confidence and go teach them what they need to know about the market that they could be missing. And so that really like helped me in my career, but also just gave me the confidence in data and like the power behind it. And then validation from those presentations of people, saying like, wow, I actually learned something I didn't think I was going to. It's always a good feeling.
It really is a good feeling. And,
Yeah.
and again, it feels good just knowing that you are indeed helping somebody understand whether it's a market or a trend or a data point, whatever that case is. It's a good feeling.
Yeah, it is.
So speaking of trends, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. And for now, we'll stick just conventional market rate space. We're talking, and for some of our listeners that maybe haven't tuned in previously, a lot of our conversation points are looking at that, institutional grade conventional market rate multifamily. We can talk a little bit about affordable, maybe not in this conversation, but broadly as part of the podcast, we can talk about affordable, or, there's other components of the industry we can talk about. But for the question that Jesse and I are going to chat about here, just looking at strictly market rate multifamily trends, what are 2 trends for 2024 that you think everyone should have on their radar?
Okay, mine could apply to any, but the things that I thought of first were, one of them is kind of silly. I'll get to that one later. The first one is the work from home trend. I actually was on a call today with a client and they were asking specifically about this. So I think it's like still kind of up in the air on what's really going to happen. We've had some callback to works. I work remote. You can see my background. I work from my house. And a lot of people still do. But one of my colleagues and I were just having a conversation, like we're really not sure what's going to happen in the next several years, because there's a lot of money tied up in the office market. Like, let's be real. What are they going to do about it? I don't know if there's going to be any kind of like, oh, you need to go back and save office or go back and do this and that. So I just kind of wonder like what's going to happen there, if that's going to change the dynamic between, because I know we've seen a lot of developers go more suburban, like what's going to happen in terms of apartment demand there? Will it shift? Will it mix? Who knows? So that's number one, is just kind of watching. Do you have thoughts on that? I kind of see you shaking your head.
No, it's one that we get that question quite a bit too. And candidly speaking, it is kind of hard to answer because a lot of what you're offering up, and some of this too goes back to our role. And one of the challenges is that sometimes you're just making a best guess. You don't necessarily have the data that says 100% this is exactly what's happening. You just kind of blend intuition and what data you have seen. And I tend to agree that I need to stop saying I tend to agree. I've said that like 5 times already in this podcast, but
we're on the same page.
Yeah, we're on the same page. It's to me, the work from anywhere trend, you're already seeing some of that start to resettle. And this isn't picking on any market in particular, but if you look at some of the very small coastal Florida markets, the demand numbers there have started to subside really sharply. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you're seeing some places like New York and Boston pick up a little bit in terms of their absorption. Yeah. And I think that some of that, it was never truly a zero-sum game. In other words, all of Port St. Lucie's surge to the top of the leaderboard wasn't because people were moving from New York. Some of that was the case. And conversely, New York wasn't losing every renter to Naples, Florida. But I do think you're seeing some of that start to shake out now. And I think some of it is work from anywhere now, I guess, called return to office driven.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. I'm really curious on what's going to happen. I know I'm safe here at home, and John will never make me go back into the office, right, John? But yeah, I think it's definitely a trend to watch. You can delete that part about me calling out that was a joke.
well, and I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a full coast removed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm East Coast, and John Burns is based out of Irvine, California, so full 3 hours ahead.
So something that comes to mind too, though, from the market research space is I actually think there's a lot of value in having a lot of folks across the map, because there is something to be said about, well, I'm looking at the Boston trends from the comfort of my home in Dallas, but, and I'm making this up for the sake of example, I've never been to Boston, but I can see the numbers. You kind of have to see some of these places too to get an idea. And I think that's one of the important parts of our role, is actually traveling to these spots to say, oh, okay, this is what makes urban Boston different than urban DC. The numbers might not look that different, but the tangible feel is very different. So I actually think there's a lot of value in having that ability to untether from an office and really gain perspective from across the country.
Yeah, we think so too. And also you get extra hours if your company is based all over the country. But that's kind of like why we like to be spread out, is because anytime, there's an event in Atlanta or we need to go check out a project in Atlanta, I'm right here. I can hop and do that on our research side. And we like to travel and get in the market too. And then we have our consultants that do that all the time. So it's really, you're right, like it's really great color and you really get the feeling. I remember when I started at co-star right out of college. That was like one of the first things they wanted us to do was we were each assigned markets. So I think like one of my first markets was Charleston, South Carolina. And so I just went there to just get a feeling of it, meet my team that was there, the sales team, do a couple of client meetings, but really like get there and get the feeling of the market. Because until you go there, like you said, it's really hard to fully understand the nuances between the different areas and why the trends are happening where they are.
Yeah, and Charleston's a cool area. I mean, that's one that I personally don't know that I could live there. It's a little bit more humid than my liking. I live in Dallas, so it's not exactly the most humid place in the world. But if you just visit the place, it's actually pretty cool. And if you're looking at a long-term investment or development play there, I think there's something to be said about that market. It does have enough of a demand base and enough drivers to actually support some of that long-term investment, at least in my view.
Yeah, I think so too. It's definitely expensive, but it was always one of my favorite markets to go to. I like made it a point to go there at least once a quarter and just go pop in on some clients and do presentations. It's just a beautiful market and there's so much history and charm, but definitely pricey, especially if you want to be down close to that. That's why they're all moving up way outside into the suburbs.
Into the burbs, yeah, into that urban to suburban movement. That's something that we get a lot of questions about too, is what is that interplay between urban, suburban? And I do have a question somewhat related to that, but before we get there, wanted to check in and see what that other trend that you said was one that you wanted to mention.
Yes, okay, this is the fun one. I'm glad you called it out because I'm passionate about this trend. It has to do with amenities. So back to that like kind of conventional market rate apartments. But okay, Carl, do you play pickleball?
I don't, but I'm familiar with what it is.
Okay. So my family, like my dad is a pickleball coach. My mom and my sister play all the time. I play tennis, but they play pickleball. They love pickleball. They're obsessed. And it is like in every new home community, like it's an amenity everywhere, like on the single family side. And so we're wondering, is it going to be a new apartment amenity? Like, is that next? So that's something that we're watching, but there's a part two to this. So pickleball is huge in the US, but in Europe, it's padel. And I don't know if you know the difference between the two. No? Okay.
Mm-mm.
So pickleball, I describe as like ping pong tennis. So it's like you're playing ping pong like with a wiffle ball, but on like a mini tennis court. Padel is the same, but you're in like a glass enclosure, I think like kind of like squash.
Okay.
So you play off the walls and everything. And so it's like really popular over in Europe because USTA created it because they were jealous of pickleball and stealing all their tennis players. And so padel, I actually, on my honeymoon, I was in Prague and they had a padel competition, like tournament going on. And there was just like a random glass enclosure in the middle of the street. And like these professionals were playing off the walls and like bouncing around. It was so cool. So Europe tends to like kind of lead trends. So I'm wondering, like, is that the next thing, the next sport that's coming over to the US? Will that be an amenity? That might be a little bit easier of an amenity in the apartment world than maybe a whole pickleball situation. But I don't know. It's something that I'm watching over here at JFrag.
I like where your head's at, though. That's an interesting one to throw out there, just because I never heard of it. I heard of squash. I played a little bit in college. We had a squash court that you could check out for an hour or whatever. So me and some friends would go play occasionally. Back when we had a lot more free time than we do now. But yeah, that's really interesting, and I wonder if that scalability of something like that. You said padel, is that right?
Padel, yeah.
Padel. Okay, so I wonder if that scalability of padel is more achievable in the apartment world than, as you mentioned, pickleball.
I think so. I think like pickleball could be good on the new home side. And also because, on the renter side, maybe they're a little bit younger. Padel is like way more fast paced because you're playing off the walls and everything. So not to discredit our seniors out there, my dad would get mad at me for just saying that. But maybe that kind of lines with the apartment renter versus like a home buyer. But
yeah.
Who knows? I'm calling it now, though.
Well, and I like that you're kind of putting yourself out there saying, hey, this is a trend that we're seeing. And I think that there is some substance to it. And I think, now, not to put words in your mouth here, but I do think that sometimes our role, you're able to go out there a little bit on a branch and say, hey, this is just something I think we're seeing. Maybe it doesn't materialize. Maybe it doesn't materialize to the degree that was initially said. But I think sometimes our role in market research, you do kind of have to put yourself out there and know that, again, we're going oftentimes on data that hasn't quite materialized yet. In other words, you just kind of have to it's a lot like forecasting the weather. You go off what the data says here, but a lot can change on that 7-day forecast. You put out your best guess, and you hope you're right, but sometimes it may be a little bit off, or maybe you forecasted 100 degrees for the high and it's 95 instead. Maybe there's a little bit of variability there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love how, like, every webinar conversation, you bring it back to the weather, because I know your background.
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing. But no, you're totally right. Forecasting is hard. And that's something that I kind of started doing here at John Burns. At CoStar, like, we had models and everything that do it for you. But here we really do, like, go dig into each metro level's data and get with our consultants and ask them what they're thinking and seeing in terms of trends. So we actually just revised our apartment rent forecast after seeing some changes. The economy is holding up way better than we thought it was going to by this time. So and people are still paying rent. So we just revised our rent forecast too, but we're not afraid to admit, like, okay, maybe we need to adjust. Maybe we need to go this way. We need to think about things different. But at the end of the day, we just want the most accurate information out for clients as possible, to give them the best kind of like looking glass into the future.
Honestly, I'm more worried about somebody that doesn't revise their forecasts, because just like you said, there's going to be things that change. There's going to be unknowns that come up. You go with your best guess at the time. But if you're not changing something in your forecast, either you got lucky and just happened to hit the number spot on, or there's something else there that you're missing because you're being too narrative driven as opposed to narrative meets data.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, you can get so set on one way that things are going to go and not be actually paying attention to what's happening. But no, we're very good about like revising our forecasts and making sure that our clients, have that crystal ball that we all wish we had.
Yeah, exactly. That we all wish we had. So on the single family side, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm out of my element when we start talking about the single family side or the build to rent side, but you work in that space a little bit more often, a little bit more intimately. So what are some things you're seeing on BTR that you think our audience should take away from this conversation? And it could be high level, but what are some BTR trends that stand out right now?
Well, like apartments, Phoenix is just like ground zero for BTR construction. It's going crazy there. So we're a little bit worried about what's going to happen there in terms of supply and market fundamentals. We're seeing a lot more activity, but we're also hearing that kind of people who want to enter this space are having a hard time kind of finding funding right now. So maybe that'll change as things hopefully get better from now on. But that's kind of like the hard barrier to entry is getting the funding for something like that. Other trends too is we're seeing some kind of like play towards density on the BTR side, high level. They were building more like single family detached homes and renting them in a dedicated community, but now kind of opting more for like a horizontal apartment. And then because of that kind of like, trying to find space to build, these are more of a suburban product usually, whereas apartments, we see a lot of urban and now some suburban too, but BTR is primarily suburban.
Yeah, I guess it
So
would
high
almost have to
level.
be just based on
Yeah,
the footprint needed alone.
exactly.
The horizontal the horizontal apartment, got tongue twisted there. That comment is interesting because again, I don't really work in this space, but I have heard that term a couple times, and it's interesting that this move towards density, and maybe some of this is municipality driven, but that move toward density does kind of seem to be a trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just like they're trying to make things pencil at this point, especially now. So
Yeah.
you have to do that.
Yeah, especially now, and that's something else that we're definitely seeing in some of the data too. Is just the financing side has some challenges right now. It doesn't mean it's not impossible, but certainly more challenging today than 2 years ago. And we'll see where all that ends up over the next few years. But I tend to think that housing holistically is still in a pretty good space for the next few years. I think you're going to see some market variability. You mentioned Phoenix. I think that market is going to be trending differently than, say, a Boston, perhaps over the next 2 or 3 years. But generally speaking, I think that the housing industry is still in a good spot.
Yeah, we agree. We agree. I think it's a good investment.
Yeah, I would be on board with that as well. So one of the things we talked about before our discussion was our audience. The podcast is going to be hosted by RealPage. It's pretty easy to find some of the RealPage material, but I did want to point the audience to some of your research, some things you're working on. What are some things you can share with us in the audience? I guess where can they find some of your research, and do you have anything you'd like to feature for our audience?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mentioned earlier that my team just put out a brand new flagship product. So it's a series of reports, but it focuses on both the apartment and the build to rent section or sector. So it really evaluates both sectors, and it's more of like a US picture, but we do go down into the markets. But we also like to pull in some color on the single family side too, and just talk a little bit to like the interplay between those sectors, as well as a little bit from SFR too. So I think it's kind of unique in the fact that we do look at residential for sale housing in addition to rental side, because I think like sometimes in my experience in the apartment world, like sometimes we get so stuck into the rental side and don't necessarily look at the for sale side and the trends that could be going on there that could possibly be affecting apartments. Like right now, inventory is super low on the resale side. For sale, these people are staying in rentals, having to move to rentals longer. So just something that could be driving demand. Also, there's always the affordability factor too. So those are some things that we evaluate in this report too. Also, your basics like construction, rents, occupancy, capital markets. We dive deep into all of that. So that's something that you can find on our website, more information on. And then also, you can find our team on LinkedIn or Twitter, or I guess it's called X now. That's going to take some getting used to. But John Burns has a great LinkedIn page too. Rick Palacios, he has a great a great Twitter page, and they publish great content. But really, our whole company is pretty good about sharing our content on social media if you ever want some freebie stuff.
Yeah, both of those are good follows. But as you mentioned, just John Burns, holistically, the company and the work you all do is really good. And not coincidentally, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you onto the podcast here, and thank you for sharing. So
Yeah.
we are getting close to the 40-minute mark, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time that's listening. And by the way, we could dive into those trends that you were just mentioning for another 45 minutes, but I'll spare our audience the long-winded discussion. Maybe at a next conference, you and I can chat a little bit more. But
Yeah.
one question I've been asking some of our other guests, and I'm just curious to hear from you here. If you weren't in your current role, what do you think you would be doing for a living?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I was like trying to think about it. I think I would be in something creative. So I originally wanted to go to school for photography. And then like
Oh,
my
wow.
dream job was a Nat Geo photographer. So had my father not advised me otherwise, I probably would be down that path. I'm artistic, or like to think I am. I like to paint and I like to take pictures. So probably something creative. I love to plan, like give me a trip or a night out and I will plan the heck out of it. So maybe an event planner or a travel agent, something like that. Something really like lame.
Travel agent's funny though, because I think there's a little bit of blend of both of those. I hadn't even thought about that, but there's that creative side where you get to kind of dream on behalf of someone, but then you get to the nuts and bolts of how do you make that happen on, an itinerary or scheduling.
Yeah. I love it. I just got to do that because I just had my wedding and honeymoon. And then like 2 weeks later, I went to Peru. So I did a lot of research and planning and itineraries and making sure that everything was good to go. And I just really enjoyed it. So I think that's probably why that's on my mind right now.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. And
thank you. Likewise.
Yeah, thank you. I guess we talked about that a couple months ago of just how the timing of those two big life events for us matched up. Yeah. But anything else you want to share with our audience before we let everyone go? And again, thank you for your time. Wanted to give you the final few minutes here to see if anything else comes up.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me, Carl. It's always good to see you. I'm sure I'll see you at some industry events in the next couple months or so. But no, I'm always here to the audience if you need any research or insight into the for sale BTR apartments, single family rentals, any of the products that I said that we offer. Always here if you have questions, or can put you in touch with one of our experts. But no, otherwise, thanks so much, Carlos. It's been fun.
Perfect. Thanks, Jesse.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.